that's the most important is there is one man who has the power to release the files and get to the truth and bring justice to the survivors, and that's Donald Trump. And Donald Trump right now needs to release the files to the American public so that the truth can come out and we can actually get some sense of justice for the survivors.
So what's your plan going to be if the Trump administration doesn't release
What do you think the significance of these photos is? Because some of these are folks we already knew had associations with Jeffrey Epstein.
I think anything that we release is significant. I think people should be able to make judgments on their own as to what they see in these photos. For us, this is about transparency. If we receive information or pictures or anything else, videos that we put out last week, and I think it's important to note that it's been oversight Democrats that have fought every single time to release all this information. And there is a White House cover-up happening right now in not releasing these files that needs to end. There are women who were raped when they were children who just want justice. Let's release.
You just watched Representative Robert Garcia stand before the American people and do something that feels almost extinct in our political moment. He told the truth about power, and he refused to look away from what that power has done, and listen carefully because what he said next is the kind of bombshell that should shatter the entire edifice of our national discourse about accountability and justice. Because Garcia accused the White House of engaging in a cover-up and demanded it end, reminding us that there are women who were raped when they were children, who just want justice, and calling to release the files immediately. This is not hyperbole. This is not partisan theatrics. This is a Democratic member of Congress formally alleging that the sitting president is personally obstructing justice for child rape survivors, and the implications of that statement should be reverberating through every newsroom and every conscience in this country right now, because we are 7 days away from a federally mandated deadline, and the question hanging over American democracy is whether Donald Trump will comply with the law he himself signed, or whether he will find yet another way to shield the powerful from the consequences of their depravity. Here's what makes this moment so absolutely volcanic in its significance, and why you need to understand the full context of what's happening right now today, December 12, 2025. Democrats on the House Oversight Committee released photos from Jeffrey Epstein's estate, showing powerful figures in the late sex trafficker's orbit, including President Donald Trump, former President Bill Clinton, Steve Bannon, Bill Gates, Richard Branson, and others, with the 19 images reinforcing that the financier was tied in the past to a wide variety of powerful and high-profile people whose ties to him are now under significant scrutiny. These photos just dropped hours ago, and they come from nearly 100,000 photos obtained by the House Committee from the estate of notorious sex predator Jeffrey Epstein that include images of President Donald Trump, former President Bill Clinton, Microsoft founder Bill Gates, film director Woody Allen, former Trump White House advisor Steve Bannon, and others in social settings. But here's the part that should make your blood run cold with recognition of how deep this goes, because Garcia said the committee's Democrats have reviewed maybe about 25,000 of the photos so far, noting there's an enormous amount of photos they have not gone through, and it will take days and weeks to ensure proper redaction, while adding that some of the other photos that we did not put out today are incredibly disturbing. Let me connect the dots here because this is where progressive analysis must cut through the noise and name what the mainstream media will dance around for another news cycle. We are watching in real time as congressional Democrats led by Garcia systematically dismantle the protective wall that has surrounded America's oligarchic class for decades. In a recent batch of emails released by the committee, Epstein claimed that Trump spent hours with one of Epstein's most prominent accusers, the late Virginia Giuffre, and Epstein also wrote in an email that Trump knew about the girls, which is an apparent reference to Trump's claim that he kicked Epstein out of his Mar-a-Lago club. Think about what that means. Think about the timeline here. Because Trump signed the bill that directs the Department of Justice to publicly release all its Jeffrey Epstein-related files, back on November 19th after losing a months-long tooth-and-nail fight to prevent their disclosure in a stunning reversal aimed chiefly at quelling a brewing GOP revolt and restoring his iron grip over the party, which means Trump fought this transparency with everything he had until his own party threatened mutiny. And now we're 1 week out from the December 19th deadline. And what do we have? We have the DOJ's Epstein files probably not being released anytime soon, because Congress's new law allows the DOJ to withhold release due to active investigations and national security, giving Trump officials broad cover to delay or heavily redact documents, especially after Trump launched an investigation into Epstein's ties to former President Bill Clinton officials at J.P. Morgan Chase and others. Do you see the maneuver here? Do you understand the sophistication of this elite protection racket? because Trump opens new investigations precisely so he can claim ongoing investigative privilege to block the very transparency he was legally compelled to provide. It's a constitutional shell game, and Garcia is calling it exactly what it is, a cover-up. Let's talk about what we know right now from the materials that have been released, because the emails and photos paint a portrait of systemic elite impunity that should radicalize anyone who still believes in the possibility of equal justice under law. There's an apparent letter of recommendation for Epstein from linguist Noam Chomsky, calling him a highly valued friend, that recalled how Epstein connected him with former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, another frequent Epstein correspondent. And there's advice Epstein gave to Steve Bannon, Trump's former strategist, about ways to build a far-right political movement overseas, with Epstein writing, "If you are going to play here, you'll have to spend time Europe by remote. Doesn't work, lots and lots of FaceTime, and hand-holding Europe can be a wife, not a mistress." The photos released today show Banafik Libing looting, one in which Epstein is sitting behind a desk, with Banafik Libing sitting on the opposite side, and another of the two of them standing together taking a selfie through a mirror. While emails released by the Oversight Committee in November showed frequent correspondence between Banafik Libing looting one, this is the Trump White House inner circle we're talking about. This is the architect of Trumpism itself, maintaining an active relationship with a sex trafficker. What Garcia understands, and what he's forcing the American public to confront, is that this is a bipartisan rot. This is not Democrats versus Republicans. This is survivors and their advocates versus an entire class of powerful men who have spent decades protecting each other. As Representative Thomas Massie noted, he does not believe Trump himself is implicated in the files, but instead is trying to protect a bunch of rich and powerful friends, billionaires, donors to his campaign friends in his social circles. That's a Republican congressman saying that about a Republican president, and it tells you everything about how the oligarchy transcends partisan boundaries when its own interests are threatened, because the Epstein Transparency Act may trigger the most significant crack in oligarchy power in a generation, with Congress compelling the DOJ to reveal Epstein's secret files as the protective wall around America's most powerful men is beginning to crumble, in what could be the first genuine challenge to the impunity enjoyed by the country's wealthiest predators. Think about the historical parallel here, because what we're witnessing is comparable to the exposure of the Catholic Church sex abuse scandal, except this time the institution being exposed is not just one church, but the entire American ruling class across finance, politics, academia, entertainment, and technology. At the center of Epstein's network were not only celebrities and financiers, but the leaders of elite universities, powerful legal minds trained at Ivy League institutions, former presidents, cabinet officials, and judges, with these individuals and institutions helping legitimize Epstein, enabling his abuse, and later participating in the cover-up directly or through willful silence. This is how power really works in America. This is the operating system behind the carefully curated public image of meritocracy and rule of law, and Garcia is doing the essential work of tearing back that curtain and refusing to let it close again. The photos are almost absurdly damning in their banality, because they show Trump and Clinton and Gates and Bannon and Woody Allen and Alan Dershowitz and Larry Summers all existing in Epstein's orbit, all benefiting from his access and largesse, all appearing comfortable in spaces that we now know were sites of industrial-scale child abuse. Other released images depict Steve Bannon and Epstein taking a photograph in a mirror, Bill Clinton with Epstein Maxwell and another couple, tech billionaire Bill Gates with the former Prince Andrew, on former Harvard president Larry Summers and lawyer Alan Dershowitz, also appeared in pictures from the estate. Every single one of these men has claimed varying degrees of distance from Epstein. Every single one has a carefully crafted narrative about how they barely knew him or cut ties years ago, and yet here's the photographic evidence showing them embedded in his world. But let's be absolutely clear about something, because the liberal establishment media is already doing damage control, suggesting these photos don't prove criminality, and that's true, and that's also completely beside the point. What these photos prove is complicity. What they prove is that America's elite knew exactly who Jeffrey Epstein was and chose to associate with him anyway, because the benefits of access outweighed any moral qualms about associating with a sex offender. Epstein's career as a wealthy financier who gave money to universities and other causes put him in many elite circles, and those circles did not entirely close to him after he pleaded guilty to state charges of solicitation of prostitution and of solicitation of prostitution with a minor under the age of 18 in 2008, with people who consulted with Epstein rarely acknowledging the severity of the crimes that required him to register as a sex offender. That's the scandal. That's what Garcia is exposing. the entire elite ecosystem that allowed a registered sex offender to continue moving freely among the powerful, because money and access create their own gravitational field that bends justice away from accountability. And speaking of accountability, let's talk about the timeline of resistance, because Trump's opposition to releasing these files tells you everything you need to know about his priorities. The administration has been reluctant to divulge more details about the investigation or release all of the files, angering some Republicans and Democrats, and raising questions about Trump's past connections to Epstein. And remember, Trump has been criticized for paying little heed to his own supporters, who have called for a full release of files kept on Epstein and his alleged crimes, which is significant because this is one of the few issues where Trump's MAGA base actually broke with him, demanding transparency that he refused to provide. The relentless intrigue surrounding the Epstein files marks the rare issue that has driven a wedge between Trump and the Republican Party. He's led for the last decade, exposing a vulnerability for the White House, made all the more frustrating by the fact that it's largely the result of a series of self-inflicted wounds, and since it became clear that he could not suppress the files' release, Trump has tried to reunify the GOP behind a new effort to tie Epstein directly to the Democratic Party. That's the playbook right there. That's how elite power protects itself. You can't suppress the information completely, so you try to weaponize it against your political opponents while using every legal mechanism available to slow-walk and redact and delay actual comprehensive disclosure. In February 2025, the U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi stated in a Fox News interview that the Epstein client list was sitting on my desk right now to review, and later that month, the White House gave binders to several prominent conservative and right-wing figures, including Liz Wheeler and Scott Presler, reading Epstein Files Phase 1, which means the administration has been selectively leaking to friendly outlets while blocking comprehensive congressional oversight. It's information warfare designed to control the narrative while preventing full transparency. Garcia gets this. Garcia understands that this is fundamentally about power, and who gets to wield it, and who gets held accountable when it's abused, and that's why his framing is so crucial, because he's not just asking for documents, he's demanding justice for survivors. Listen to how he talks about this. Garcia told reporters, "That's the most important, is there is one man who has the power to release the files and get to the truth and bring justice to the survivors, and that's Donald Trump, and Donald Trump right now needs to release the files to the American public so that the truth can come out and can actually get some sense of justice for the survivors." That rhetoric matters, because it centers the victims. It refuses to let this become just another political food fight between Democrats and Republicans. It insists that at the core of this scandal are real human beings, whose lives were destroyed by powerful men who have faced almost no consequences. And that brings us to the question of what happens next week, because, given that the Department of Justice has been given a 30-day deadline to release the documents, the files are expected to be made public on or around December 19, 2025, but it is unclear when or even whether the public will see the files or how complete they might be, as the bill includes several exceptions to a full release that could complicate or delay disclosure. The law allows the DOJ to withhold or redact the identities and personal and medical files of Epstein's victims, and the DOJ can also withhold material that would constitute a clearly unwarranted invasion of personal privacy or depicts or contains child sexual abuse, which are reasonable protections, but also create enormous loopholes that a bad faith administration could exploit to block release of anything remotely damaging to powerful figures. Senators from both parties say the DOJ must comply with the law and release the files within 30 days. However, some lawmakers are concerned the administration may find other ways to block it. And those concerns are well-founded because we've already seen the FBI spent over 4,700 overtime hours, costing the U.S. government over $851,000 to redact files related to the Epstein investigation, which suggests a massive effort to control what information actually sees daylight. Think about that resource allocation. Think about the government spending nearly $1 million in overtime just to decide what the public isn't allowed to know about elite criminality, and then try to tell me with a straight face that we don't have a two-tiered justice system. Garcia is also making a crucial procedural argument that deserves more attention because he wrote to Attorney General Pam Bondi that as a district court ruled when House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jim Jordan subpoenaed Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg for his involvement with the ongoing criminal prosecution of Trump, Congress has broad and indispensable power to conduct investigations, reminding Bondi that the subpoena issued by the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform requires her to release the complete unredacted Epstein files to the committee, including classified information and material relevant to ongoing investigations, while protecting the identity of survivors and potential victims. This is Garcia wielding the precedent that Republicans themselves established when they were investigating Trump's prosecutors. He's taking their own legal arguments and turning them back on the administration to demand full compliance with congressional oversight. And it's exactly the kind of strategic thinking that progressives need to see more of from Democratic leadership. But we also need to talk about what's being revealed in these photos beyond just who appears in them, because the images include images of sex toys, and from left a pile of sex toys, a hand-worn sex toy, and a novelty condom featuring a caricature of Donald Trump, which Democrats released as part of the documentation of Epstein's world. These are not gratuitous details. These are evidence of the lifestyle and practices of the spaces where abuse occurred, and their inclusion in the congressional release serves to remind the public that we're not talking about abstract questions of association. We're talking about concrete spaces where children were victimized and where powerful men had access. What's also significant is how Republican committee members are responding, because a spokesperson for the committee accused Democrats on the panel of cherry-picking photos and making targeted redactions to create a false narrative about President Trump, noting we received over 95,000 photos and Democrats released just a handful, and claiming Democrats' hoax against President Trump has been completely debunked. Nothing in the documents we've received shows any wrongdoing, while calling it shameful. Rep. Garcia and Democrats continue to put politics above justice for the Cradle-a-Mod. That response is fascinating because it's simultaneously admitting that Republicans have access to the same 95,000 photos and choosing not to release them, accusing Democrats of politicization, while offering no counter-narrative or alternative photos that would exonerate Trump, and weaponizing concern for survivors to shut down transparency, which is the exact opposite of what survivors are actually asking for. The whole Republican counterattack falls apart under minimal scrutiny, because if these photos are cherry-picked and meaningless, then release the full set. If Trump's associations were innocent, then release the complete documentation. If there's no there, then why did Trump fight this disclosure for months, and why is the administration already laying groundwork to invoke loopholes and exemptions to limit what comes out next week? The answer is obvious to anyone operating in good faith. Trump and the elite network around him are terrified of full transparency, because full transparency would reveal the depth and duration of relationships that they've spent years lying about, and we need to sit with the victim testimony here, because Epstein survivors are continuing their push for the release of the files, with survivor Danny Bensky telling media, "This is not political for us. This is a survivor issue, and we are grateful for all the individuals who came together to make this happen. We are cautiously optimistic that the release will focus on transparency so that the evildoers can no longer live in the shadows. That's what's at stake. That's what Garcia is fighting for. The ability of survivors to finally see justice after decades of being gaslit and silenced and ignored by institutions that valued elite reputations more than child safety. What makes this scandal different from others in higher education is not just the scale of abuse, but the depth of institutional complicity with universities, unable to hide behind the claim of ignorance, and government officials, unable to pretend to be impartial arbiters of justice when they are protecting their own. And if elite higher education wants to regain any moral authority, it must reckon honestly with the Epstein files. This is fundamentally about whether institutions or individuals will be held accountable, because we're watching a test case for elite impunity in the 21st century, and the preliminary results are not encouraging. Representatives of some Epstein survivors have asked for a third-party review to check if any record has been scrubbed, softened, or quietly removed before the public sees it, as the Trump administration is required to release virtually all files on the government's investigations into Epstein by a December 19 deadline with minimal redactions, following months of pressure from both parties for the Trump administration to disclose more information. The fact that survivors don't trust the process tells you everything about how institutions have failed them repeatedly. The allegation that federal workers looked for mentions of Trump was initially leveled over the summer by Senate Judiciary Committee Vice Chair Democratic Senator Dick Durbin, who cited information his office had received, with the New York Times later reporting that the FBI looked for references to Trump and other high-profile people, which if true represents an unprecedented politicization of a criminal investigation to protect a sitting president. Garcia is also making the transparency argument in the strongest possible terms because he told reporters the released photos were significant, and noted that Democrats on the panel have only combed through about a quarter of the 95,000 photos that have been handed over, saying, "I think anything that we release is significant. I think clearly. I think people should be able to make judgments on their own as to what they see in these photos. For us, this is about transparency," and in an earlier statement said it was time to end this White House cover-up and bring justice to the survivors of Jeffrey Epstein and his powerful friends. That framing is critical because it treats the American people as adults capable of processing complex information and drawing their own conclusions rather than accepting elite declarations that certain associations were innocent or certain relationships were merely social. Let's also talk about the legal architecture that's enabling this obstruction, because Republican Representative Thomas Massie, who led the charge to circumvent GOP leadership and force the legislation, warned that the DOJ would be committing a crime if they do not abide by next week's deadline, saying it's a crime if they don't. It's not like they're in contempt of Congress because they didn't respond to a subpoena. This is a new law with criminal implications. If they don't follow it, that means we're heading into a constitutional confrontation where either the Trump administration complies with federal law or administration officials are potentially subject to criminal prosecution for obstruction, and we're about to find out whether laws actually constrain executive power when that power is wielded on behalf of elite interests. The broader context here is essential because this is happening at a moment when 6 years ago Christine Pelosi seemed to grasp what many assumed was obvious, that an honest accounting of Epstein's harms and affiliations would implicate powerful Democrats and Republicans alike, and amid the momentum of the Me Too movement, insisted that the truth should be known whatever the fallout. But in 2025, amid the flurry of horrors competing for our attention each day, there is less moral clarity in the public sphere about the need to center the experience of victims or to put a stop to sexual violence. We are in a moment of Me Too backlash where powerful men who faced accountability are attempting comebacks, and where the political establishment of both parties would prefer to memory hole the entire reckoning around sexual violence and elite abuse. But Garcia and other progressives refuse to let that happen because they understand that once you allow elite impunity to be re-established, the entire project of justice becomes impossible. Think about what it means that in a recent batch of emails released by the committee, Epstein claimed that Trump spent hours with one of Epstein's most prominent accusers, the late Virginia Giuffre, and Epstein also wrote in an email that Trump knew about the girls. And remember that Virginia Giuffre filed a civil lawsuit against Prince Andrew in 2021, with Andrew settling out of court in 2022 without acknowledging any wrongdoing, and Giuffre reportedly died by suicide in April of 2025. One of the most prominent survivors who had the courage to name powerful men and pursue accountability is now dead, and we're left with emails and photos and testimony that powerful interests want to keep buried, which is exactly why Garcia's work right now is so crucial, because he's ensuring that Giuffre's voice and the voices of all survivors continue to be heard even when the predator class wants them silenced. The moral clarity Garcia brings to this fight is desperately needed, because the scandal around the Epstein files is not a sideshow, but an opportunity to ask better questions, a case that could expose the bipartisan architecture of elite impunity and the culture of complicity that sustains it, because to wave off every horror as a distraction is to participate in the very obfuscation that protects the powerful. That's the progressive argument in its purest form, that sunshine is the best disinfectant, that transparency is a prerequisite for accountability, that justice cannot exist when powerful people get to decide what the public is allowed to know about their own misconduct. Garcia understands this at a molecular level, and he's willing to spend his political capital forcing the issue even when it would be easier to let it go, even when both party establishments would prefer he shut up and move on. We're 7 days away from finding out whether laws mean anything when they threaten elite interests. 7 days from learning whether Trump will comply with legislation he signed, or whether he'll find some fig leaf of legality to justify continued obstruction. 7 days from a moment of truth about whether American democracy can actually hold power accountable, or whether the entire system is just an elaborate kabuki theater designed to give the appearance of justice while protecting the oligarchy. Garcia has drawn the line, he's made the accusation explicit, he's called it a White House cover-up, and he's demanding immediate release of all files to bring justice to women who were raped as children. That's the standard, that's the test, and every single person in power will now have to declare which side they're on. Do you stand with survivors and transparency, or do you stand with elite impunity and institutional protection? There is no middle ground here. There is no both sides centrism that can paper over the fundamental choice, and Representative Garcia just made sure that everyone watching understands exactly what's at stake and exactly who's responsible for delivering justice or obstructing it. The files must be released, the truth must come out, and the powerful men who hurt children must face consequences. Anything less is complicity in the cover-up, and Garcia just put his name on the line to make sure we never forget it.